Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream of History by podcast. In this episode, I am joined by Kamil Gregor. Today's topic will center around his recent publication he co-authored with Brian Blais in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus in Brill Publishers. It is titled, Is Name Popularity a Good Test of Historicity? A Statistical Evaluation of Richard Bauckham's Onomastic Argument. Welcome to the show, Kamil.
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you.
And good to have you here. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about yourself before we continue?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't seen me before, I've been kind of around on other channels and stuff like that. I'm Kamil. I'm based in Prague, and I'm currently a PhD student in classics. And this is actually my first publication in the field of New Testament studies, so I'm really excited to talk about it. I recently did a video covering the article on Apologia, and there was a follow-up stream on myth vision. But I guess the audience of this channel might not be completely overlapping, so I thought it would be a good idea to also talk about it here and maybe answer any other questions about unrelated topics and stuff like that.
So can you tell us a bit about Professor Bauckham's onomastic argument? What is that exactly?
Yeah, that's a good point. So basically, I got the idea a couple of years ago when I was reading Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. That's this like massive book that Richard Bauckham published in about 2007, right? He's a New Testament scholar. He's very prolific, very influential. And this is one of his most popular, I would say probably most popular and most impactful books that he written. And basically in the book, he argues that four canonical gospels are, and the book of Acts, are based on eyewitness testimony, meaning the people who wrote it had direct access to eyewitnesses to the events that are depicted in the works. And in case of the Gospel of John, he argues that an eyewitness actually wrote it. So the author of the Gospel of John was a person named John who was a disciple of Jesus. And when the book was published, and since then, it's been pretty heavily criticized. There's been a lot of reviews in the first year after its publication, and a lot of scholars have covered various aspects of the book since then. I think about a year or 2 years ago, Jeffrey Tripp, who's also been around, not sure if he was on your channel, wrote a paper that covers another aspect of Bauckham's book that hasn't been addressed yet. But the book is extremely influential. It's actually one of the most heavily cited publications in biblical studies if you control for how old is it, so how much time it has to accumulate citations by other scholars, right? But at the same time, and it's not surprising given how much criticism the book got, a lot of the arguments in the book are actually pretty goofy. And it's interesting because Bauckham it's one of the few scholars, I would say, that he tries to put forward like novel arguments for why I think that the Gospels are actually written by eyewitnesses, right? Because scholars who still hold that position are usually recycling a lot of the arguments that have been around since forever. So, the traditional attestation to traditional authorship is unanimous, except when it's not. All of the works have always been known, are attributed to these people, except in all the cases where they were not, and stuff like that, But Bauckham actually tries to put forward some new arguments. But what I noticed is that there is one chapter which hasn't been responded to, and it's really interesting. And I was thinking about why is that? And it's a book that's called Palestinian Jewish Names, and it's a chapter in which he argues that look, we have a list of every known Jewish person in antiquity and their names. And there's actually quite a lot of people like that. It amounts to several thousand. I think it's about 15,000 in like a 500 years that are covered by the data. And there's actually so much data about how Jews were named that you can look at how popular different names were. So we can, for example, see that in the first century in Jewish Palestine, the most popular male name was Simon, and so on. Kipsalos was not very popular among first century Palestinian Jews, right? And the idea that Bauckham got was he basically took all the people in Gospels and Acts that are named, and he checked what is the distribution of name popularity in that text. So, for example, in Gospels and Acts, you have 8 people named Simon, and it's actually the most popular name in Gospels and Acts. And the idea was that he lined up those 2 popularity distributions. So on one hand, you have a name popularity distribution in Gospels and Acts, and on the other hand, you have a name popularity distribution in the contemporary population. And he basically found out, or at least that's the claim, that the 2 distributions line up extremely well. And because of that, he was kind of, I guess, bamboozled by his own numbers, right? In that chapter, he formulated some extremely strong conclusions about what follows from that. What follows from the fact that, for example, Simon is the most popular name both in Gospels and Acts, but also in the Palestinian Jewish population. And he basically argues that this can only happen if the people who are depicted in Gospels and Acts actually existed in history and were not invented in like a long process of oral transmission, when different stories about Jesus, talking to people, healing them, and so on, were gradually invented together with the name characters and their personal names. Because Bauckham thinks that if that long process of invention took place, especially if it took place outside Palestine, because critical scholars typically imagine that the Gospels were written outside Palestine, so in places like Alexandria, Rome, and so on, the 2 distributions just wouldn't line up, right? So, for example, if the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome, let's say, in late or second half of the 2nd century, or the last quarter of the 2nd century, the 2 distributions just wouldn't line up, because Mark wouldn't know which names were appropriately popular in Jewish Palestine, so he wouldn't be able to use the appropriate names for any invented characters, right? So Bauckham says there were no Jerusalem Times at the time that included like a list of the most popular names that were given to babies born in that year or something like that. And what we basically did in the paper, we re-examined his data, first of all, and then we re-examined his conclusions using the appropriate statistical methods. So maybe we can talk next about that. Sure. Unless you have any questions. Yeah, sure. So basically what we did, the biggest problem with the chapter that I have, apart from the fact that almost no scholar paid any attention to it, and all those scholars were actually impressed, it seems, by it, because it works with kind of like a hard data, right? There are actual numbers and percentages in it, which is not super common in biblical studies. In biblical studies, when you argue, you often rely on like a very soft argumentation about what's plausible, what could possibly be the case, and you talk about motivations of literary authors, you talk about the ways how communities transfer information and stuff like that. And that's like a very fluid kind of way of reasoning, right? But in some cases, it happens that you actually have hard data, so you can anchor kind of your theories, or at least seemingly, in these data points. And so I think a lot of scholars avoided answering or responding to that chapter because they don't have the technical expertise, or they just assume that because Bauckham is using hard data, then his conclusions must be solid. But I actually co-authored the paper with a professional statistician, with Brian, who teaches statistics at a university. And we decided to actually see if the conclusions of the chapter hold if you perform the appropriate statistical analysis. Because what's really interesting is that even though the conclusions of the chapter are very strong, Bauckham actually doesn't do any statistical tests. So he only tabulates the numbers, he looks at the tables, and he kind of notices that the 2 distributions look similar. So Simon, for example, is the most popular in both data sets, and then it kind of gets progressively less popular from there. He notices that there are some outliers. For example, there are too many people named James in Gospels and Acts, and too few people named Lazarus relative to the contemporary population. But he says, okay, it kind of looks like a good match. And he calculates some percentages that are self-selected. And based on that, he formulates these insanely strong conclusions. So what we did, we actually basically redo the analysis, but this time we used the appropriate statistical methods. And it was actually interesting because I thought, okay, maybe we'll just use his data, the way how they are tabulated in his book. But then, luckily, I decided to go back to his primary source and check his work when it comes to data collection and kind of data aggregation. And I found out that there are some big issues. So the way how he works with the data is he basically aggregates them from a resource that's called the Lexicon of personal Jewish names in late antiquity, something like that. It's this massive 4-volume work that took about 30 years to publish. It's the research is ongoing, so I guess now it's more than 50 years of research that have been invested into it. And it's basically like a phone book of every known named Jewish person from antiquity that we have knowledge of. So everyone that we've ever encountered in inscriptions, on coins, in ossuaries, in all the literary sources, ostraka, basically everything. Every time a person is mentioned by name, and there's a reason to believe that they were Jewish, he gets added to the lexicon, and that's like one entry. And as I mentioned, there is a lot of people already, several thousands. So you can just aggregate them and you can tabulate it to get the information about name popularity. So I just borrowed the lexicon, the raw data from a local library of the Jewish Museum. And I very quickly figured out that the tables with the aggregated numbers that are found in Baukham's book don't actually match with what's in the lexicon at all. So it seems that in some cases, Bauckham is not super clear, is not explicit about the way how he aggregates the numbers, because there's a lot of judgment calls that you need to make about who counts as a valid entry. Some people you have to throw out because, for example, we are not sure that the word in question is even a personal name. There are ambiguities about that. In some cases, we are not sure whether the person was Jewish. We are not sure whether the person actually existed, right? And in many cases, there are ambiguities about whether two occurrences of the same name are actually the same person or multiple different people. And this is a problem even in Gospels and Acts. Like different Christian traditions have different ways of kind of harmonizing who is who in the New Testament. So in some traditions, for example, Matthew and Levi are two different people, but in some traditions, they are the same person, right? So I found out that I actually can't use his numbers. I need to go back to the lexicon and I need to basically build my own data set from scratch because we were just not able to reproduce his data and we were not able to reproduce any of the percentages that he actually uses to evaluate how well the two distributions line up. And it's interesting because it looks like in some cases, the errors that we found in the tables are because of either typos or the tables were just not printed correctly. Like he, for example, says that there are 4 persons named Eros in the New Testament, which is obviously not correct, right? But 4 is actually the correct number for the total number of persons named Eros that are attested. So it looks like what happened is that when the table was put together, like the number 4 was placed in both columns, but it's a mistake, right? And when you actually look at the patterns of the miscalculations in his tables, you can see that very often the correct number is found somewhere else, like in the next row or column. So this wouldn't be a problem unless you want to actually, reproduce his work. But it's really strange because the book has been reprinted in 2017, so it's already in the 2nd edition. Bauckham, in the preface to the 2nd edition, actually says that there isn't anything that he would really want to change compared to the 1st edition. But it seems that, first of all, nobody checked his work. Nobody really noticed in the 17 years since the book has been out. And this wasn't even pointed out when the 2nd edition was put in print. So that's kind of problematic, right? When you're working with numbers. And then basically, so what we did with it is we, as I mentioned, applied the appropriate statistical methods. So we put together the actual sample, like the real sample, not the miscalculated, incorrect numbers that are found in his book. And the way how we basically evaluated it was we questioned his underlying assumption about what kind of names would be given if invention took place, especially if it took place in the diaspora. Because basically, even though he's working with numbers and he has percentages and stuff like that, most of the conclusions of this chapter kind of rest on the assumption that if invention of characters took place, period, and especially if it took place outside Palestine in the diaspora, the people making the invention, either traders of oral traditions, inventing stories and passing them along in this like long process of anonymous community transmission, or even the gospel authors, they would be more likely to give characters names that are popular in the location that they are based. So for example, if you have invention of names taking place in Italy, you would expect that there would be a tendency to give the characters names that are popular in Italy at the time, so in the 1st century, let's say the end of the 2nd century. If invention took place, let's say in Alexandria, you would expect that invented characters would be given names that were popular in Alexandria. And we actually question whether this is like a reasonable assumption to hold, or whether it's possible that 1st century Christians were exposed to relative popularity of specifically Jewish names in Palestine, and whether it's reasonable to assume that they had at least some idea about some names being more popular than others. And we kind of suggested some plausible channels of exposure, let's say, that even people in the diaspora would have, that would give them at least some indication that some Palestinian Jewish names are more popular than others. And I outline several these plausible channels of exposure in the article, but just to give you an example, name popularity in the 1st century in Jewish Palestine was actually really strange, because a very large percentage of names were accounted for by a very small number of names. Meaning, like if you met a random Jewish person from Palestine, it was very likely that he's going to have one of very few names, right? So kind of the pool of names that people were choosing from was relatively small. If you compare it, for example, to ancient Greeks, that's not the situation that you see. There was lots and lots of Greek names, meaning if you met a random Greek person, the probability that they are going to have like a given Greek name was very small, right? With the Roman or Latin names, the situation was much more similar to the Jewish names. So for some reason, Romans, when they were giving names to their kids, had a tendency to just recycle the same names over and over. Like everyone was named Decimus or Sextus and so on, right? So actually the pool of names that people are choosing from was very small. In the modern world, we usually have a very wide pools of names. So even though there might be names that are like relatively popular in a given country in a given period of time, let's say John in the US today, there is a lot of names that are used, right? But not so in Jewish Palestine. And specifically, it seems that there was a very strong tendency for Palestinian Jews to give their names, to give their children names of the Maccabean leaders. So that would be Matthew, Simon, Joseph, Yohanan, Jude, or Judas, Matthew, and I think there's one other name. Why is that? Well, it's because, and this is like a leading hypothesis, that was basically a way for Palestinian Jews to identify with the Maccabean project against Hellenization, let's say, of Jewish Palestine, right? It's much more complicated than that, but basically it was a form of nationalism or patriotism. It was a way to identify with like a specific, let's say, political ideology or a set of political ideas. And it's actually this concentration, let's say, of personal names to specifically the Maccabean names was very pronounced. In the 1st century in Palestine, about almost 40% of all names, of all males, had one of the Maccabean names, which is a lot. Like that percentage is much higher than what you would get if you measured what's the percentage of the most popular names among Greek population or among Roman population or among most modern populations, right? And given there is this extremely strong tendency to use specifically Maccabean names, it's not super implausible to imagine that people would know that this is stereotypically how specifically Palestinian Jews are named, right? Like if 40% of males have just like 8 names or something like that, people are going to notice, right? And people are going to know, oh yeah, like he's from Palestine, so he must be named Simon. There were maybe jokes about people from Palestine, Palestinian Jews. I'm not sure if we have that attested, but if there were jokes like that, it's plausible that characters in those jokes had those Maccabean names because those were stereotypically Palestinian Jewish names, right? So that's like one plausible channel of exposure. That's like one reason why I think that even people that were living in the diaspora would have at least some idea that some Palestinian Jewish names were more popular than others. A different channel of exposure is obviously prior literary sources. So, for example, if you ask the question, why is it the case that the name Simon is the most popular in the Gospel of Mark? It's not, in the Gospel of Matthew, it's not difficult to explain. The reason is because Matthew adopted most of his name characters from the Gospel of Mark. So you can explain the pattern of name popularity in the Gospel of Matthew in virtue of Matthew using a source, namely the Gospel of Mark, right? And if you look specifically at the Gospel of Mark, it's actually interesting because he has 2 groups of names that have overlaps. And those 2 lists of names actually account for a lot of the occurrences of the most popular names. And those are specifically the list of the 12 apostles and then the list of Jesus's brothers. Because in both lists, you have Simons, right? There's Simon Peter and there is Simon, brother of Jesus. You have a person named Joseph in both. You have a person named Jude or Judas in both, and so on, right? And what we point out in the article is that, well, for all we know, one or both of these lists could be authentic, either completely or partially. And if this list was something that the author of the Gospel of Mark had access to, either in a written form or just through oral tradition, then it's not implausible to imagine that when he needed a new name for an invented character, like Simon the Leper, for example, he would just pick an appropriately Jewish name, Palestinian Jewish name from that list, right? And then other authors after the author of the Gospel of Mark would do the same, either with previous Gospels or with other literary sources. So, for example, there is a very popular, or it's a hypothesis that's gaining popularity, I would say, that the author of Luke Acts had access to the works of Josephus, right? I think it's really plausible, given all of the literary features that have been pointed out by like Steve Mason, Richard Perver, and so on. And not surprisingly, you have a lot of Palestinian Jews in the works of Josephus, right? So if you imagine that the author of Acts or Luke Acts has a copy of the, let's say, Antiquities of the Jews, it's not difficult to imagine that he had some idea about certain names being more popular in Palestine than other names. So that's like another channel of exposure. And it's actually interesting if you think about, because if you look at the total sample of name characters in Gospels and Acts, Luke Acts, and most specifically Acts, accounts for a big chunk of that sample. Why? Well, because you have a lot of name characters in Acts, right? And actually, the author of Luke Acts adds a lot of name characters that don't show up in previous Gospels because he continues the story, right? So in Acts, the action moves further in time and also in space, so it takes place elsewhere. So you get a lot of new characters that have additional names, right? So actually, when you ask the question, why is it the case that the 2 distributions of names in Gospels and Acts and in the contemporary population line up so well? Well, it's the author of Luke Acts who is to a large degree responsible for this. And he's precisely the one who has been postulated to have used a historical source, namely the writings of Josephus that have a lot of named Palestinian Jewish characters in them. So it's not super implausible to imagine that he would get an idea about relative popularity of personal names, right? So yeah, do you have any questions so far, or should I move to the actual statistical analysis?
Well, what I like to ask is,
Mhm.
since he thinks that Luke acts, along with everything else, the other gospels too, that these are eyewitness texts, how does he make that work with Acts in his argument, since Acts is about largely about Paul and in his ministry? It covers a lot a lot about his life. Does he think that Luke was written first when not long after the crucifixion or something like that? Then he gets around to Acts way later?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So he dates. So he thinks that the author of Luke Acts is actually Luke, a physician and traveling companion of Paul, and that some section of Acts are actually written from autopsy. So the author is talking about himself, about events that he personally witnessed, right? So he thinks that I'm not actually sure about the. He says that Luke was written circa 70 or 80, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So he actually agrees with the traditional dating, but he just thinks that Luke Acts was actually written by a traveling companion of Paul, meaning Luke would have written, assuming Paul was martyred in Rome in like 60s or something like that, Luke would have written Luke Acts with a gap of about 20 years after the events in the end of Acts, right? And when it comes to the content of Luke, which Luke obviously didn't witness, he thinks that Luke relied on eyewitness sources. So he interviewed people that were actually there, I don't know, 50 years ago, witnessing these events, right? And you might think that this is implausible given the extreme amount of time that have elapsed. But you have to keep in mind that he thinks that, for example, John was written around the same time. So again, in 80s, he would probably go, but again, I'm not super clear. I'm not super clear about that. He would probably go with the traditional date of 80s, of 90s. Sorry. So he would say, okay, the Gospel of John was written in 90s, but it was still written by John, a disciple of Jesus, who was just like super old at the time, right? And he thinks it's not implausible that there would be eyewitnesses still living around that time, because he thinks that Papias of Hierapolis, who wrote this famous, commentary on Jesus's oracles, Bauckham thinks that he collected eyewitness testimony from people who knew eyewitnesses, and that Papias did this collection. He basically collected the material around the same time, so in 80s or 90s. And he thinks that at the time when Papias was collecting this material from companion of apostles and disciples, some of the disciples were still around. They were still alive. So, for example, in the famous fragment of Papias, where Papias seems to be listing his sources, his eyewitness sources, he says that there are two disciples of Jesus, John the Elder and Ariston. And Papias, as he's quoted by Eusebius, says, and they are saying. He uses the present tense, indicative presence in Greek, and Bauckham parses this as Papias basically implying or stating that around the time these people were still living, right? So even in 80s and 90s, you had at least some of the disciples of Jesus who were still around and who were available for questioning for authors who are like interested in collecting testimony from eyewitnesses and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess that would be his position.
And does he seem to think that Mark is first and then the others came later, or does he think Matthew came first?
He basically adopts or accepts the traditional chronology, right? So he thinks that Mark was written first, not sure about the date, But he then places Matthew and Luke later. He says circa 80. I think the date that he gives is 80, if I'm not mistaken. And then he thinks that John was written last. And what's really interesting is that he thinks that John was written as it is, basically. He thinks that the canonical John was written by an eyewitness, including chapter 21, which I would say it's probably a consensus at this point that was added later. And it's actually funny that if you ask scholars who actually think that the chapter was added by Luke, that the chapter was added by John. So they think that the Gospel of John still has only one author, John, but that author, for some reason, decided to add the last chapter at some later point, right? So that's kind of a way how you can, have your cake and eat it too. You can still hold to the traditional authorship, and you can at the same time acknowledge that the last chapter was added. It was just added by the same guy. Bauckham, however, thinks that the whole thing, the entirety of canonical John, is a unitary composition, and that the last chapter wasn't added later. And he actually makes arguments for why we think that the last chapter was a part of the original work. And those arguments are like profoundly goofy. Those are some of the strangest arguments that that are in the book, basically. So yeah.
Does he think that Luke knew Matthew or vice versa, or does he think they both borrow from Q? Does he think that Luke knew Matthew or vice versa? You can't hear me?
Seems to be we're having some technical difficulties. Let me check my audio settings. Yeah. My headphones disconnected. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. It's just my headphones disconnected for some reason. Can you hear an echo or something?
I do not hear any echo at all.
Okay, so let's go on.
So does he think that Luke knew Matthew or Matthew knew Luke, or does he believe in the Q source?
I think he thinks they are independent. So yeah, he does believe in the Q source.
Mm.
Yeah.
But does he think that Q? Go ahead.
No, it's actually interesting how he deals with like some of that stuff. So, for example, he thinks that he doesn't try to harmonize genealogies. He just thinks that I think Luke's genealogy, if I'm not mistaken, is more likely to be authentic. But he acknowledges that when it comes to genealogies, there might be some like historically inaccurate information. So he's not like an inerrantist or something like that, which that's plausible given his hypothesis, right? Because if you move further back in time and you get to Jesus's birth and his childhood and stuff like that, that would be really difficult for someone to get good, reliable information about in late first century, right? Like those, because that's already removed like 80 years from when the author is supposed to be writing, right? He does harmonize the list of the 12 apostles. He just thinks it's the same people, except some of them, they had multiple names, basically. And in one list, one of the two names is given, and in the other list, a different name is given for the same person. But what's really interesting is that he thinks that Matthew and Levi were the same person, but it was really implausible for a Palestinian Jew to have two Hebrew names. And this is actually coming from his analysis of the onomastic data, so data about personal names. Because what you have very often is that a Palestinian Jew had also a Greek or Latin name. So, for example, John Mark, right? Yohanan is a Hebrew name, Marcus is a Latin name. That was relatively frequent. But what you almost never find And it's actually very difficult to find even a single case that wouldn't have ambiguities, question marks around it and stuff like that, are first century Palestinian Jews that would be using two Hebrew names. So not Hebrew and Greek or Latin, but two Hebrew names. But if you think that Matthew and Levi are the same person, that would have to be the case, right? You would have, because both Matthew and Levi are Hebrew names, that would be like an outlier. And based on that, he thinks that actually Matthew wasn't written by Matthew the apostle. And this is basically a historical inaccuracy, that for some reason, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew decided to alter the personal identity of the person in the calling, the story of the calling of the Apostle Levi in the Gospel of Mark, to make it about Matthew. And this isn't what actually happened in history, right? He still thinks that the Gospel of Matthew is written by, he still thinks that the Gospel of Matthew is based on eyewitness testimony. He thinks that it's based on eyewitness testimony of Matthew the Apostle, but he doesn't think that the author is Matthew. This is one of the points that's like most unclear in the book. He's not very specific about the origin of the Gospel of Matthew. He thinks it was written by like disciples of Matthew or something like that, but it's like that's one of the murkiest, let's say, parts of his overall thesis, because yeah, it's very difficult to like line up these various data points, right?
Can you resume discussing the statistical issues with
yeah,
with
sure
work?
So okay, so basically in the first section of the article, we just went through all of the issues with data collection, with data aggregation and stuff like that. We just talk about how the numbers that are found in the book are not reproducible, because there seem to be miscalculations, errors and stuff like that. And we also outline some of the reasons why we think it's plausible that even people who are living in the diaspora in, let's say, late first century would have at least some idea about certain Palestinian Jewish names being more popular than others. But it's obviously very difficult to exactly estimate how much information people in the century would have about name popularity, right? So it's basically very difficult to model. You might think that they had some vague idea. You might think they might have a pretty good idea. Some people might have a better idea than others and so on. So what we decided to do instead is to basically dichotomize the two competing hypotheses as much as possible, and then basically compare whether results of statistical modeling on these two scenarios are empirically distinguishable. So basically we took Baukham's thesis on one hand, which is the idea that every single person in Gospels and Acts actually existed in history, so nobody is invented. And then the second scenario that we modeled is the most extreme negation of this thesis. So what we are actually saying in the second most extreme scenario is that every single character that appears in Gospels and Acts was invented together with their names, specifically by people who had absolutely no idea about name popularity in Jewish Palestine, which means they were no more likely to pick a common name for an invented character than a rare name. And this applies to everyone who shows up in Gospels and Acts, except for people that are externally attested. So we, for example, grant obviously that Jesus existed, Herod the Great existed, John the Baptist existed, and so on, right? So we just take the sample of named Gospels and Acts characters, and we exclude everyone who has an external attestation by Josephus, by Paul, and so on. And this is because these people are not in contention of being invented. So scholars who are polemical against Bauckham, and scholars who don't obviously accept that Gospels and Acts were based on eyewitness testimony don't dispute that, for example, Herod the Great actually existed, right? He's not a candidate for being an invented character. So the two extreme scenarios, again, is everyone is historical, and the opposite extreme is everyone is invented, except for people who are externally attested. And they are specifically invented by people who have no idea about name popularity in ancient Palestine. And then we basically modeled the distribution of name popularity that we would get on these two different scenarios, and we compared them, and we checked whether they produce statistically significantly different results, meaning whether they are actually empirically indistinguishable, right? Whether you can tell them apart when you look at the data and when you do the appropriate statistical analysis. The way how we modeled the first scenario, so Bauckham scenario, is basically if you imagine that you have a hat and you are picking randomly names from a hat and you are putting them into a text, and the names in the hat are weighted depending on their popularity in the first century Palestinian Jewish population. So, for example, there are more Simons in the hat than there are names like Kipsalos or Harkak or something like that were very rare. So when you are randomly putting names out of a hat and you are putting them into a text, you are much more likely to draw a name Simon because there is more Simons in the hat. And the reason why there are more names Simon in the hat is because that's the name that was very popular in the first century Palestine. And if you do these random draws, you get a distribution of name popularity that basically follows the distribution of name popularity in ancient Palestine, in first century Palestine, Jewish Palestine, because you are randomly drawing from a pool of names that's weighted by that statistical distribution. So when you draw a random sample out of that hat, you are most likely going to have a large number of persons named Simon, because that's the most popular name. And you are much less likely to have rare names like Alexander, Agrippa, and so on, because they are much less represented in the hat because they were much less popular in first century Palestine. So that's the model that corresponds to Baukham's thesis, right? So if everyone existed, then you would get a distribution that follows the distribution in first century Palestine. And the second hat is the most extreme negation of that. So everyone is invented except for people who are not externally attested, and they are specifically invented with no information about name popularity. So basically the way how you model that is you scramble information about name popularity. You are again picking names randomly out of a hat and you are putting them into a text, but this time you are no more likely to draw a rare name when compared to a popular name. So every name has the same chance of being drawn. Why? Well, because you are drawing it without any information about name popularity, right? So basically it equalizes the likelihood that any given name is going to be drawn. So for example, Simon is just as likely to be drawn as any other name. It's random draws from like a uniform distribution, basically. And what you do with that is then you construct confidence intervals, basically, which tell you what is the most likely number of names that you are going to pick on either model. The confidence interval is basically an interval. So for example, on the first model, you are expected to draw between 1 and 8 Simons. That's the most expected number. On the second model, you are most likely to draw 0 to 1 Simons, right? And what you do then is you basically just overlap the two confidence intervals and you see if they overlap, how much they overlap, and whether they are statistically significantly different. I have some visual aid, so if you want me to share the screen, I can show you the results.
Sure.
Cool. Share screen. It's disabled, so I think you need to...
let me fix that. There, you should be able to now.
All right.
Cool. I wish I could have just set it automatically to enable all the time, but
yeah.
I
think
single
Zoom,
time.
Yeah, Zoom doesn't want to do that because for like security reasons, basically. Mm-hmm. Can you see the chart?
I can.
Cool. So we have people. So Simon, Lazarus. Can you see my mouse cursor or no?
Yes, I can.
Oh, awesome. Nice. So this is basically names. They are listed in the order of popularity in the first century Palestinian population. So Simon, as I mentioned, is the most popular. The second most popular name is Joseph, and so on. Herod, for example, is not very popular name. And then we have a number of occurrences. So basically how many users of that specific name there are in Gospels and Acts. So for example, and these diamond markers correspond to the number of users in Gospels and Acts. So there are 8 different people named Simon that show up in Gospels and Acts. There are 6 people named Joseph. There's only 1 Lazarus. The reason why there is only 1 Lazarus is because Bauckham thinks that Lazarus in Luke is a different person than Lazarus in John. And he thinks that Lazarus in Luke didn't exist because he only shows up in a parable. So he excludes him from the data set as a fictional character. But he thinks that the Lazarus in the Gospel of John actually existed. So that's the one occurrence of the name Lazarus in Gospels and Acts. Then you have 3 people named Judas and so on. And what these colors, so orange and blue, show are the 2 different confidence intervals. And because we need to overlap them, I decided to visualize them differently. So the orange confident interval is the expected number of occurrences that you would get on the first model, on the model that everyone is historical and they existed together with their personal name. And the blue area corresponds to the confidence interval on the second model. So the second model is that everyone is invented except for people who are externally attested. So basically you have the same information except for the 2 scenarios. And in the first case, it's visualized as an interval. And in the second case, it's basically visualized as an area so that you can put one on top of each other, right? And then the markers are color-coded depending on how these 2 distributions overlap. So first of all, we have James, who is an outlier. So there are basically too many persons named James on either scenario. So there is something fishy going on with Jameses, right? We wouldn't expect to get that many Jameses on either Baukham's model or on the model that everyone is invented by people who just had no idea about name popularity, right? It might be just an outlier that is, due to random chance that can happen. Or it could, for example, be the case that some of the people that are named James in Gospels and Acts that are depicted as 2 different people were originally the same person. And in the process of oral transmission, they became two different persons, basically. So it could be the case, for example, that James, the brother of Jesus, and James the lesser, or James the younger, were originally the same person named James. And like somewhere the wires got crossed and they became 2 different persons. So now there is a overrepresentation of the name James, right? There are some other instances like that. I think there are like 4 names in total that are overrepresented. Not every name is shown here because you have like 400 names. It wouldn't fit into the chart, right? Another person that's overrepresented is Alphonse. So Bauckham thinks there are 2 persons named Alphonse. One is father of James and the other one is father of Levi, the minor apostles. He thinks they are 2 different people. And because he thinks there are 2 different people, suddenly the name becomes overrepresented, right? Because Alphonse just wasn't a very popular name in first century Jewish Palestine. But the most important takeaway is the difference between the orange diamond markers and the blue diamond markers. Because the blue diamond markers show all the names that have exactly the value that you would expect on the hypothesis or in the scenario that everyone is invented by people who have absolutely no idea about name popularity. Because on that hypothesis, the expected number of occurrences of every name, most popular name, the least popular name, everything, is at most 1. And as you can see, almost the entire Gospels and Acts dataset are people who show up only once, or names that have only 1 user, right? So you have 1 Lazarus, which is entirely expected on the hypothesis that everyone is invented. You have 1 Jesus, right? There are actually 2 Jesuses, Jesus Barabbas, there are actually multiple Jesuses, but Bauckham only thinks that 1 is valid, and we exclude the other. Bauckham only thinks some of them are valid, and we exclude the ones that are externally attested, which only gets you 1 Jesus. You have only 1 Matthew, and so on. You have only 1 Levi. All of these occurrences are entirely expected on the scenario under which everyone is invented. So you can throw out almost the entire data set and it wouldn't make any difference. So almost all of the data that we have available is undistinguishable from a white random noise, right? And the orange markers are the only names where the number of occurrences is higher than what's expected on the hypothesis that everyone is invented by people who have absolutely no idea about name popularity. So you have more than one Simon, more than one Joseph, you have multiple Judases, multiple Johns, and then there are some people who show up, like twice, Zacharias and Alexander, and that's it, basically. These are the only names that show up more than once, which is what is expected on the most extreme scenario of everyone being invented. So as you can see, you don't actually need to explain that much data, right? And what's very important to realize that these most popular names that are the only ones that are different from the most extreme negation of Baukham's thesis are exactly the names that we think people would be aware of as being the most popular in Jewish Palestine, because those are the names that pass through the channels of exposure that I know that I outlined. So they are, for example, Maccabean names, right? So all you need to do is to explain this residual data, is to imagine that there are some characters in Gospels and Acts that are invented, but they were invented by people who were at least somewhat more likely to pick one of these names than a name like Heracles, Dionysus, Apollodoros, and so on, right? And it's not super implausible that this would be taking place, because, as I mentioned earlier, there are these channels of exposure that would expose people, even in the diaspora, to specifically these names, right? And another thing that's really important to realize is that for every name, the two confidence intervals actually overlap. They even overlap in the case of Simon, because if there was just one Simon, that would be consistent with both extreme scenarios, right? But for every other name except for Simon, the blue confidence interval is actually inside the orange confidence interval, which means the two hypotheses, the two most extreme negations of what might be going on in Gospels and Acts, is not actually producing statistically significantly different results. And this is very important. So even if every person in Gospels and Acts had a different name, right? So even if every name in Gospels and Acts had exactly one user, it wouldn't produce statistically significantly different results from the hypothesis that everyone is invented by people who have absolutely no idea about relative name popularity. And of course, you have to realize that the two scenarios that we are comparing are extremes. So we have the extreme negation of Baukham's thesis is that everyone is invented by people who have absolutely no idea what's going on in first century Palestine in terms of name popularity, right? And in between those two extremes, you can obviously imagine a very wide range of less extreme and therefore more historically plausible scenarios. For example, and this is what I think, and this is what most scholars probably think, is that some of these contested characters are historical, some of them are invented. And the invention took place in communities that had at least some vague idea about some names being more popular than others, and were therefore more likely to name an invented character Simon than, let's say, Isidorus, right? And that's all that it takes to explain the data. And if even the most extreme scenarios that we model are not empirically distinguishable, any less extreme and more historically plausible scenarios are not going to be empirically distinguishable either. They are going to be even closer together when it comes to what you are expected to observe than what we are modeling, right? And to contrast it, we can see how this looks in the works of Josephus, right? So we basically redid the same analysis, taking names from the works of Josephus. So this is the same information. The markers show you the number of persons with a given name in the four works of Josephus, who lived in first century Palestine. So they are first century Palestinian Jews. So Josephus has names 21 Palestinian Jews in the first century that are named Simon. He names 16 first century Palestinian Jews who are named Joseph, 15 persons named Lazarus, and so on. And we basically constructed the two scenarios, and we again showed the confidence intervals. You can see that there are two outliers that are visible in the chart. One is Alexander and one is Herod, which means Josephus is much more likely to mention a person named Alexander and a person named Herod. And he actually overrepresents them compared to the total population, right? So they are overrepresented when it comes to how popular these names were. And it's not very difficult to explain why, right? Why is it the case that Josephus mentions way more persons named Herod than what corresponds to the popularity of that name in the first century Palestinian Jewish population? Well, it's because that was the name of the rulers, right? That was like a royal name in the Herodian family, which is named Herodian after the name Herod. So, of course, this is one of the names that's going to be overrepresented, right? One of the names that's almost overrepresented, it's not as bad, but it's very close, is Jesus, actually. So Josephus mentions a lot of persons named Jesus, and he almost overrepresents them when you look at how popular the name Jesus is in the first century Palestinian Jewish population. And again, it's not very difficult to explain that because Jesus was a priestly name. So in certain families, it seems that the name was very popular because those families were aristocratic. A lot of the priests of the Second Temple were recruited from those families. And the reason why specifically the name Jesus was priestly is because, of course, Jesus was the name of the first priest of the Second Temple, right? So that's, again, like a reason why that name was very popular in that specific social situation. But what's very important is that you have to look at whether these two confidence intervals, so the orange one, which is visualized as an interval, and the blue one, which is visualized as an area, whether they overlap or not. And what you can see in the works of Josephus is that they overlap for a lot of the names. For all of the blue names, so the blue diamond marks, those are, again, all of the names where the two scenarios that we are modeling don't give us any statistically significantly different results. Meaning, when it comes, for example, to the name Ishmael, you can't look at the works of Josephus and distinguish between a scenario in which everyone who is mentioned by Josephus actually existed and the scenario in which everyone mentioned by Josephus is invented. And Josephus just had no idea about name popularity, right? So there are some names like that, but much less than was the case with Gospels and Acts. Then there are the orange diamond markers, which are names that have more users in the works of Josephus than we would expect on the most extreme scenario of everyone being invented. But those are still the instances where the two confidence intervals overlap, meaning the two most extreme scenarios don't actually give us any statistically significant results, right? But what's very important is that in the case of Josephus, when it comes to the most popular names, we have the green diamond markers. And those are the names when the confidence intervals don't overlap, which means those are the names for which there are actually statistically significant results, which means that when it comes to Josephus, we can actually test whether the extreme scenario of everyone being invented is true or not. Because if it was true, the actual number of people using these most popular names would be in the blue interval. So you would have very few people named Simon, very few people named Joseph, Lazarus, and so on. But what we are actually seeing, that the numbers of people in the works of Josephus are not in that blue area. There are in the orange area, which corresponds to the numbers of people bearing that name corresponding to its popularity in the first century Palestinian Jewish population. So in this case, we can say that the data lines up, and that what we are seeing in Josephus is expected on the hypothesis that Josephus is writing about real historical persons. But when it comes to Gospels and Acts, we can't say that, because when it comes to Gospels and Acts, every name overlaps, even the most popular name, right? So even if there was just one Simon, one Joseph, one Lazarus, one Judas in Gospels and Acts, you wouldn't be able to say that that's statistically significantly worse than what you would expect on the scenario that everyone is invented by people who have absolutely no idea about name popularity, right? We can even put the two distributions together, right? So on the left, you see Gospels and Acts. On the right, you see Josephus, right? And basically, the green diamond marks are the only data points in Josephus where we can see that Josephus lines up with history. These are the only data points where you can say, okay, Josephus is statistically significantly better than just randomly picking names out of a hat. But for Gospels and Acts, we don't have any name like that, because even for the most popular name Simon, the two intervals actually overlap. So you don't get statistically significantly different results on both. And now the question is, why is this the case, right? Why is it the case that this analysis, when it comes to Gospels and Acts, is not informative? And the reason is because the sample size of personal names in Gospels and Acts is just too small, right? In Josephus, you have about 272 occurrences of 110 names, I think, right? So there's 110 names of first century Palestinian Jews, males, in Josephus. And those 110 names have 272 different users. But in Gospels and Acts, that sample size is much, much smaller, which means that you are much less likely to get results that are actually statistically significantly different when you use the appropriate statistical analysis. And this is basically, this basically means that the extremely strong conclusions that Bauckham draws in that chapter about how the pattern of name popularity distribution in Gospel and Acts could not possibly have resulted from invention of characters, especially if that invention took place in Palestine, just isn't tenable. Because if you actually collect the data appropriately, right, if you fix all of the miscalculations, typos, and stuff like that, and you actually do the work that Bauckham should have done in the first place, so you ask an actual professional statistician, you consult him on the methods, and you perform the appropriate analysis, you find out that actually it's a wash, right? The data is just, there's just too few data to tell either way, basically. So that this is the core of the core of the statistical analysis. And what's very, very exciting, I think, is that we not only found that Bauckham's conclusions don't follow, we actually even found some evidence that some of the people bearing the most popular names might be invented. So before we move to that, are there any questions about this previous section?
I have none so far.
Cool. So what's the evidence of invention? So basically, you can look at how many rare names there are in Gospels and Acts. And we define a rare name the same way Bauckham does. We define a rare name as a name that's attested only once in the contemporary Palestinian Jewish population, right? So if we only ever find one person who was using that name among all of the different Palestinian Jews that are in the lexicon, right, that counts as a rare name. In Gospels and Acts, we have 4. We have Aeneas, who shows up in Acts. That's the person who is raised by Paul. That was a very rare name among Palestinian Jews. Not surprising, right? Because Aeneas was the legendary founder of what was eventually the city of Rome, or like the Roman population in Italy. There are some other Palestinian Jews, first century Palestinian Jews, who are using that name, but that was not very popular. Then you have Agabus, who is a prophet in the book of Acts again. And then you have the healing miracle in the Gospel of Mark, where you have a person named Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus isn't a personal name, that's actually a way how to identify someone by giving their parents' name. In this case, the father's name. So Bartimaeus just means the son of Timaeus. And I think in the Gospel of Mark, it actually says, and this might be either authorial comment or that might be like a marginal note that eventually got incorporated into the manuscript. It says, Jesus healed Bartimaeus, or Jesus met Bartimaeus, which means the father of Timaeus. Meaning either the original audience of the Gospel of Mark didn't know that Bar means son in Hebrew, so they might have been Gentile or something like that, or it's just something that the author added because he thought that, okay, maybe someone who is going to read this isn't going to know that Bartimaeus means the son of Timaeus. Or it might be something that someone just wrote on the margin of a scroll or codex, and then like a generation later, when that codex was copied, it was just incorporated into the text, right? So now we have Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. And Bauckham basically says, okay, we can count these as two different Palestinian Jews. One was named Bartimaeus and the other one was named Timaeus. That was his father. So those are two instances. So you have rare names, 4 rare names, right? And then you can ask the question, okay, how many rare names would we expect to see in Gospels and Acts if Baukham's thesis was correct, right? So how many rare names would actually correspond to the name popularity in Palestinian Jewish population in the first century? Well, we can model that, right? So this is the distribution. As I mentioned, the way how we model what we would expect to see on Baukham's thesis is by drawing names randomly out of a hat, but the names in the hat are represented proportionally to their popularity in the first century population. So there are, for example, more Simons in the hat than there are, let's say, Heraclises, right? Because the name Simon was much more popular among first century Palestinian Jews than the name Heracles. So when you are drawing from that hat, where the probability that you are going to draw a particular name is weighted by its popularity in the first century Palestinian Jewish population, you are obviously much more likely to draw Simon than, let's say, Dionysus or Heracles or something like that. And this basically shows how likely you are going to draw a particular number of rare names, right? So when you are drawing from this hat that has the number of names weighted so that it corresponds to the name distribution in the first century Palestinian Jewish population, you are most likely to draw 10 names out of the sample size that corresponds to how many names there are in Gospels and Acts. So Bauckham works with a sample of about 70 people. When you throw out everyone who is attested, you get 53 name occurrences. So if you draw 53 names out of that hat, the most likely number of rare names is 10. So you would get that about 13% of the times, right? Drawing more or less rare names than 10 gets progressively less likely. So for example, you are extremely unlikely to draw 20 rare names. That's almost impossible, right? Just because there weren't that many rare names attested in the Palestinian Jewish population. But what's really interesting is that the value that we observe in Gospels and Acts is 4. That's very, very few given how many rare names there were among first century Palestinian Jews and how many first century Palestinian Jews were using rare name, right? You would expect that if Bauckham was right, and if everyone in Gospels and Acts actually existed in history, and if they had the correct name, correct meaning corresponding to name popularity in first century Palestinian Jewish population, there would be many, many more people in Gospels and Acts with these rare names. You would get maybe 8, maybe 12. It would be somewhere around 10. But we only have 4. And that's very, very unlikely. The probability that you would get 4 or less is like 2%. Like the cumulative probability for the bars, the black bars in the chart, which corresponds to the actual observed value or less, is like 2%. That's very, very unlikely, right? Now, what explains that? What explains this outlier? Well, maybe it's the case that Baukham's thesis is right, and this is just a fluke, right? Maybe this is just like a random outlier, that we have too few rare names, much less than we would expect. But how likely is that? Well, it's not very likely, right? It's 98% probability that you would get more rare names than you actually do. But if some of the people in Gospels and Acts are invented, then you can actually explain this, because you can say, okay, well, maybe people who were making doing the inventions, people who were engaging in this process, inventing stories, inventing characters, and giving them made-up names, didn't know about rare names in Jewish Palestine, right? They knew that Palestinian Jews are stereotypically named Simon and James and Joseph, so they were much more likely to use one of those names, because those are the names that they knew about. But they wouldn't know about a rare name. And that's why you have so few people bearing rare names, right? So here you have an observation that is very, very unlikely on one hypothesis, but it's kind of expected on the other hypothesis, right? And it's called evidence. So this is statistical evidence that some of the people in Gospels and Acts might be invented. And that gets better, because rare names are underrepresented, but some of the most popular names are overrepresented. So as I mentioned, in Gospels and Acts, there are 8 characters that are given the name Simon. That's way too much compared to how popular the name Simon was in the contemporary Palestinian Jewish population. Because again, if you are drawing the sample of the size of the contested Gospels and Acts sample from a hat, where the distribution of name popularity is weighted so that it corresponds to the distribution in first century Palestine, the most likely number of Simons that you would draw is 3. It corresponds to about, so you would basically draw 3 Simons about 20% of the times, right? But you have 8 Simons, which is very, very unlikely. Again, the cumulative probability is relatively very small. So that's the black bars in the chart. And the white bars in the chart this time correspond to how many Simons you are expected to find in Gospels and Acts on the hypothesis that every single contested person in Gospels and Acts is actually invented. Because on that hypothesis, you would expect to find, most probably, only one Simon. The probability that there would randomly be 2 or more is very, very small. And what's really interesting about that is that how likely you are to get an outcome that is consistent with the most extreme negation of Baukham's thesis is actually more probable than what you have in Gospels and Acts. Meaning, the name Simon in Gospels and Acts is massively overrepresented. And because it's massively overrepresented, it lines up with the Palestinian Jewish population worse than the most extreme negation of Baukham's thesis, meaning the scenario where every single named character was invented by people who had absolutely no idea about name popularity, except all the people that are externally attested, right? So in this case, the observed Gospels and Acts data aligns with first century Palestinian Jewish population worse than the most extreme negation of Baukham's thesis, right? And again, how likely is it that this would happen on Baukham's thesis? Well, not very likely. You know, that would be a fluke. The probability of this happening just randomly, if Bauckham is correct, is very, very small. But again, if it's the case that some of the people in Gospels and Acts are invented, this is explicable because, as I mentioned, it's plausible that the people doing the invention would know stereotypical, most popular Palestinian Jewish names like Simon. So they would have a greater propensity, a greater tendency to use those names as opposed to the rare names, right? So, for example, Simon the leper might be invented. So let's say the author of the Gospel of Mark or some of his oral sources, someone in the line of transmission, right, invented the story of Jesus's feet being anointed, head/feet being anointed, depending on which gospel you read, or maybe it was both. And at some point, someone decided to name the person in whose house this incident took place. And because they had some idea that Simon is a very popular Palestinian Jewish name, they decided to go with that name. Maybe the author of the Gospel of Mark needed a name to give to that character. He knew that, okay, one of the 12 apostles was named Simon. There was a Simon among Jesus's brother. This is a good name to pick, so I'm going to use this name. And because this tendency existed, that's how you get the name Simon overrepresented in Gospels and Acts. And there are some other names that have the same problem. James, as I mentioned, is also overrepresented. And the overrepresented names are precisely the names that are the most popular. So those are the names that are most likely to be known as stereotypically Palestinian Jewish, let's say, even by people who were not, eyewitnesses to Jesus's miracles and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the evidence for invention, basically, statistical evidence for invention. Any questions about that? Because I have one more thing that I want to show.
You could go ahead and show that one more thing you were talking about.
Yeah. So okay. So maybe the most straightforward test of Baukham's thesis that you can think of is comparing Gospels and Acts with some other ancient works that we can establish have a lot of fictional characters in, right? Because Baukham's basically saying, okay, if a lot of characters that show in Gospels and Acts that show up in Gospels and Acts were invented, then we wouldn't expect the two distributions to line up so well. Well, if this is true, then if you pick a different ancient work that also has a lot of first century Palestinian Jewish characters, but they are invented, you wouldn't expect to find the two distributions lining up so well. So we decided to test this, basically. And we tested it on 3 corpora. This is, by the way, not in the article. This is in a second article that is hopefully going to be published as well. We just were not able to put everything into just one paper. So this is forthcoming, basically. So we decided to look at 3 textual corpora. One is Gospels and Acts, which has 79 name occurrences, 53 are contested, meaning 53 name occurrences are not attested outside Gospels and Acts. So those would not include Herod the Great, John the Baptist, and so on. Then the second textual corpus that we decided to look at is a corpus of Christian Apocrypha. So what we basically did is we took Clementine Homilies, which is a novel, basically, where the main character is Clement of Rome. He's a disciple of Peter, or he's depicted as a disciple of Peter. And it's basically a novel about Peter's preaching in Palestine, about his rivalry with Simon of Samaria, and so on. Then we picked Acts of Pilate, which is a very late ancient retelling of the events in the canonical Gospels. And then we picked a book. It's a chronicle, basically, by a very late Eastern author named Solomon of Basra. He's writing in the 13th century. His chronicle has a really strange title, The Book of the Bee. I think it's a biblical reference, if I'm not mistaken, but it's basically a chronicle. It's a history of the world, starting from the creation, going all the way back to basically his own time. And the reason why we decided to pick these sources is because those sources are extra-biblical. They include a lot of first century Palestinian Jewish characters that are named, but a lot of them are actually fictional. So for example, in Clementine Homilies, you have a list of disciples of Peter, but a lot of scholars think that this is just an invented list, right? It's mostly because Clementine Homilies are considered very late. So it's unlikely that the author would have any reliable information about who the disciples of Peter in Jewish Palestine were. There are conflicting traditions about what Peter did after Jesus' death, and so on. Of course, this is pseudepigraphal, so the author is not actually Clement. There are people who doubt that there was a connection between Clement and Peter in the first place, and so on. In the Gospel of Nicodemus or Acts of Pilate, you have a lot of named characters because it's basically pretending to be like court proceedings. So you have a lot of witnesses that are named. So, for example, a lot of the characters that are unnamed in the canonical Gospels are given name here because they functioned as eyewitnesses. So, for example, the shepherds that were attending Jesus's birth are given names. I think there's like 12 of them. There are named witnesses to some of his miracles, to his appearance after his death, and so on. And also it includes a list of judges who are actually proceeding over Jesus's trial. So in the Gospels, in the canonical Gospels, you only have the high priests, basically, I think 3 altogether. The most prominent one is Joseph Caiaphas. And then you have the Sanhedrin Council as kind of like a collective body, but they are anonymous. The only other member of the council who is named is Joseph of Arimathea, and he becomes a member of the council after the Gospel of Mark. But here in Acts of Pilate, you actually have a lot more names of these council members. And in Solomon's of Basra, the Book of the Bee, you have a lot of names of first century Palestinian Jews who we think are fictional, because he basically synthesizes a lot of previous Christian apocryphal works. So you have a lot of named characters that show up in apocryphal stories about Jesus' nativity. You have names of some of his other disciples that became prominent as founders of various churches and so on. So in this case, when you combine these 3 Christian apocryphal works, you have 84 named occurrences. 80 are contested, meaning they belong to people who are not externally attested. Some of them are the same as characters in Gospels and Acts. So, for example, Joseph of Arimathea shows in the canonical Gospels, obviously, and he also shows up here, obviously. But what's important is that in this Christian apocryphal corpus, we have 52 name occurrences of characters that are recognizably fictitious. So nobody thinks that these people actually existed. So in this case, almost the entire data set actually are people who are fictitious, right? So if Baukham's thesis is correct, we should see some massive differences in terms of how well the distribution of name popularity in these works aligns with name popularity in Gospels and Acts. And the last corpus that we decided to look at is the Babylonian Talmud, because that's a body of work that also names a lot of first century Palestinian Jews, rabbis, for example, but other characters as well, their disciples and so on. There's a lot of them. We decided to use the Babylonian Talmud, not the Jerusalem one, because it's later. It's from outside Palestine, so it's a better test of the validity of Baukham's thesis, but also it's bigger and it has more named first century Palestinian Jewish characters. So it's like, again, a better test. And in this case, we have 93 name occurrences. When we throw out everyone who is attested, so again, the Talmud obviously mentions Herod the Great and so on, we get 87 people and 18 of them are considered fictitious. There are some like apocryphal stories that are clearly not historical and they are taking place in first century Palestine. Like there is a famous story in the Babylonian Talmud about how a slave was supposed to deliver an invitation to like a dinner party, but he confused 2 people with the same name. So he just delivered the invitation to the wrong house, and the person who was not invited got upset, and he basically complained to the Romans, and one thing led to another, and it resulted in the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple. So this is like an apocryphal story that explains in the Talmud why is it the case that the Romans destroyed the second temple. And it was basically like a domino of events. And the first domino piece falling was this one slave who delivered a party invitation to a wrong house. Scholars think that this didn't happen, obviously, right? But here we have actually 2 fictitious first century named Palestinian Jews. The 2 persons who had the same name that the slave confused, right? So these are like 2 out of the 18 recognizing fictitious persons. Okay, so we have these 3 textual corpora, and what we did is basically we recreated the same analysis and we compared the results. And basically, if Bauckham is correct, you should see that the distribution of name popularity in these apocryphal sources lines up with the distribution in the first century Palestinian Jewish population worse than it does in Gospels and Acts. Because Baukham's thesis is that in Gospels and Acts, the people who are depicted there actually existed. But in these other textual corpora, there's a lot of fictitious characters, right? So they should like spoil or skew the distribution, and it should kind of be all over the place, right? But if you actually look at the results of the analysis, there is no detectable difference. It lines up more or less the same, right? So this is the same analysis that I showed before for the three corpora. And I intentionally removed the labels so that your audience can't immediately tell who is Gospels and Acts, right? If they were watching the entire video, they would be able to tell because they have already seen one of the charts in color, right? But the point is, if you don't know which one is the one that is supposed to only have the historical characters and which two of the three charts are the ones that have a lot of fictional characters in them, you wouldn't know the difference. And there are some outliers sometimes, like this corpus, for example, has too few persons named Joseph. This one has too many persons named James. But as you can see, it's a wash. And this gives us a very strong reason to doubt that Baukham's analysis is actually very substantive. Because when we compare it with textual corpora that actually do have a lot of fictitious characters in them, we see that the results are pretty much the same as they are for Gospels and Acts. So yeah, that concludes my presentation. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Yeah, I do have one. Even if one were to grant Richard Bauckham's claims, his statistical conclusions, and say that, oh, he's correct, how does that, like, I guess I'm stumped on, how does that even demonstrate they're eyewitnesses anyway, even if that is all right? What does that have to do with them being eyewitnesses?
That's a good question, right? So I think this is something that has already been obviously pointed out in the various responses and reviews of the book. So there's basically like a disconnect between what this specific chapter is supposed to demonstrate and his overarching thesis of the canonical Gospels and Acts being based on eyewitness testimony, right? Because the various reviews pointed out that for all we know, Jesus actually encountered a person named Bartimaeus. It's just the story was blown out of proportion, right? But there was an actual historical person. And I think the reason why this disconnect exists in the book is because Bauckham is arguing against like a specific stream of critical New Testament scholarship, which is called form criticism, which basically entails that between the events that are depicted in the Gospels and when the Gospels were composed, so when they were actually written down by their authors, there was like a long stream of anonymous community transmission. So people telling stories to people who were telling stories and stuff like that. And a lot of the material that we find in the Gospels was actually invented in this process of long, like a game of telephone. And the forum critics even claim that they are able to detect that certain components, certain episodes or stories in the Gospels have a certain form because that form fit a specific need of the community that was telling these stories at a given time, right? So for example, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, oh, at some point in the future, after I'm dead, you are going to be brought before rulers and synagogue leaders, and you will be questioned, you will be oppressed, and so on. When that happens, do not prepare in advance what you are going to say. Do not compose like defense speeches and stuff like that. Just rely on the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit is going to tell you what will happen. Now, what's more likely, that this is something that the historical Jesus actually said, or that this is like a story that was invented later by people that this was happening to? You know, like form critics and a lot of critical New Testament scholars would say, okay, this is probably something that was invented and it was retroactively placed on the lips of Jesus so that we have a story about Jesus kind of intercepting the problems that we are experiencing right now, giving us advice, authoritative advice about what we are supposed to do, right? So Bauckham is basically contending against this thesis, and this thesis does posit a lot of invention of characters, of names. He cites Rudolf Bultmann, who, for example, identified specific people who he thought were invented. He gave reasons why he thinks that those people were given the specific names that they were given and stuff like that. So it's basically like Bauckham is dichotomizing between his hypothesis and the form critical view. But of course, form critics have been all dead for like 50 plus years, right? It's not a stream of New Testament scholarship that would be alive today. Bauckham claims, and this is probably true, that a lot of even though the conclusions of form criticism have been questioned and rejected and stuff like that, and nobody is, I think today, like proudly self-identifying as a form critic, a lot of the background assumptions and a lot of maybe some of the methodology and background knowledge that the form critics were relying to is still like salient in New Testament scholarship today. Like, for example, Bart Ehrman is not a form critic, but you can see through his education, through the people that he read, through his teachers and other people that he interacted in the previous generation of New Testament scholars, that he was kind of like suckling at the teeth of the form critics, right? And a lot of his views, I think, have some traces of this form critical view. And this is what Bauckham is basically arguing against. But of course, you don't have to be a form critic, and you don't have to think that the canonical gospels were written by the eyewitnesses. You can just think that, okay, the people that are depicted there maybe existed, a lot of them even. It's just the stories were exaggerated. Maybe they were exaggerated even by the eyewitnesses, you know? Like, if I was Peter and someone showed me a story in which Jesus is walking on water and I'm in the ship with him, why would I like object against that? That's like a great story, right? Just think about how many people are going to repent and enter the kingdom of heaven because that story is in circulation. Like, people are fine with other people telling false stories about them. That happens all the time, you know, and that definitely happened in the ancient times. Like monarchs and kings and so on had deliberate like misinformation spread around them all the time. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Kamil Gregor.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.